Hi, everybody. I hope everybody's getting settled in. I know it's Zoom, but I thought I'd just say that anyway. My name is Mahala Cafiello. I am with World Affairs Council in Austin, and we are happy to have back with us again Dr. Roy Casagranda. He's a professor of government here in Austin at the Austin Community College, and he's going to provide us with a very relevant and a very timely update on affairs in the Middle East. We all have something to learn here, and I'm very excited to see what comes of it. With that, I'd like to introduce Roy Casagranda. All right.
Thank you so much. Okay, so for those of you who have heard me talk before, you probably already know that I have this compulsion to always give a bunch of background information. Like, it's not just good enough to talk specifically about that particular event. So I definitely am going to do an overview of the current configuration, and I'm going to do it from sort of an overview looking at power relations between the regional powers and then to a degree, but to a lesser degree, the superpowers. But before I do that, I want to set up how we even got to this point. I've been a teacher for 25 years, and I know that from experience that U.S. knowledge of the Middle East is pretty close to zero. So if you already know all this, I'm really sorry that I'm doing it, but let's do it anyway. So if we go with historians, and we assume that civilization is 5,100 years old, so 51 centuries old. And that's actually a good place to start. And the reason is because the state has already existed. We've already had government by that point for probably as many as 15 centuries. It's just those states are pretty primitive and they haven't really developed strong power relations yet with each other or internally. So by about 5,100 centuries back, we're just starting to get powerful enough states. Like, for example, Egypt unifies. So it's just powerful enough that you can go and you can conquer your neighbors and assemble something similar to a superpower. In that 51 centuries, a global superpower has been anchored in the Middle East for 47. In other words, if you were to randomly drop in the human experience over the last 5,100 years, you would find that except for 4 centuries, there was a global superpower in the Middle East. Usually, it was in the form of Egypt or Persia. Those are the two most common. But obviously, there are others, right? Like the Hittites and the Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And then, of course, in recent years, initially the Arab Empire, and then that was, of course, replaced by the Seljuks briefly, although they were never particularly interesting. And then the reason why they go away is the Mongols tear them up, and then they get replaced by the Ottomans. And then, of course, the Ottoman Empire itself was a global superpower. I think we tend to look at it through the lens of the Ottoman Empire of the early 20th century, which, of course, is not a global superpower by any means. It was on its way out. But the reality is that the Ottoman Empire, for the longest time, produced the best soldier man for man on the planet, and was giving the major European powers a run for the money. They conquered all the way to Hungary, and they actually put Austria under siege twice, once in the 16th century and one in the 17th century. 1683 was the second siege. And, you know, had they captured Vienna on either of those 2 occasions, it would have dramatically changed all of European history in ways that we can't even comprehend. And the reason I'm laying all this out is because those 4 centuries where there was no Middle East global superpower, 2 of those was when the Mongols tore through the Middle East, starting in the 13th century and ending in the 15th century. The other 2 are the last 2. In other words, those 4, that extreme unusual situation where there is no global superpower from the Middle East, half of that time has been the last 2 centuries. So when we talk about the Middle East, we talk about it as if it's always had the status that it has now. And the reality is the status it has now is an extraordinarily unusual status that in fact that there is no Egyptian or Persian or Arab superpower is strange. I don't want to go into the details of how that happened because we just don't have the time for that. But what I want to set up is this notion that there was a very serious attempt in the 20th century to fix that. And that attempt actually originated in Egypt. It grew out of Egypt's independence protests that took place in 1919. And its high watermark, of course, was the rise of President Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1952, 1956, depending on when you want to date his moment of taking power, and was a very serious possibility in the Middle East right up until 1967. It's so serious, in fact, that the Egyptians managed to create two institutions, the United Arab Republic and the United Arab States, in an effort to do this. And here's what the goal was. The Egyptians under Nasser and the Egyptians in 1919 in the streets protesting British occupation believed that if you could create a single Arab state that stretched from Morocco to Iraq, that Arab state would then at least be in a position to defend itself. That in other words, it would no longer be prey to English and French interests. And the reason, of course, that mattered was because the English and the French had slowly been carving up the Middle East. It's worth pointing out that they don't get the full project, right, until they disassemble the Ottoman Empire, and that doesn't happen until 1919. In other words, Europe conquered the planet. There's a handful of states. It's easy to mention the number of states, the names of the states that didn't get conquered by Europe, because it was Thailand, it was Japan, it was Korea. I mean, right, Europe got a piece of China, and Europe got all of India, and Europe got all of Africa. Liberia is a little iffy, but that was under US protection, which is the only reason they didn't get Liberia, and they got all of North and South America. And they missed Turkey and they missed Persia, but they got the Middle East, but only at the last minute. And that's because the Middle East was still this lingering power. It wasn't quite finished yet. And so what the Egyptians thought, these pan-Arab socialists who wanted to create this single state, was if we can do this, we can at least prevent a situation like had arisen in the 19th century and then into the 20th century, where France and Great Britain divided up the Middle East. For France and Great Britain, then, stopping Gamal Abdel Nasser became a high priority. And it eventually got the interest of the United States in 1958. And the United States' response to this movement was to invade Lebanon with Marines, and then to threaten to nuke Iraq, which seems arbitrary, but it really wasn't. Eisenhower was very strategic about what he did. The reason he threatened to nuke Iraq is Iraq was planning to join this United Arab Republic. Syria joined. So Egypt and Syria were merged together. Nasser was the president of both. And Yemen was working its way towards it. So there was serious movement, like this really might happen. And so the United States decided that the way they could preempt this was through invading Lebanon and threatening to nuke Iraq. And also, the United States backed the communists in Iraq because they believed that the communists would resist unification with Egypt. One of the strange events for our purposes, because it feels like a coincidence, but it's probably not, was that Yemen broke out into a civil war in this time period. And the Yemeni Civil War fell along, at its North Yemen, South Yemen was a British protectorate. In North Yemen, it fell along the line of whether or not Yemen should be a monarchy or a republic. And so on the one side, there were the guys fighting for Yemen's republic. They wanted to create a secular socialist republic. And on the other side, there were the monarchists. And the side fighting for the secular socialist republic invited Egypt to intervene into the civil war. The other side got support from the United States, Great Britain, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And of course, in many ways, it was the moment that Israel and Saudi Arabia looked at each other funny and went, wait a minute, we're on the same side on this? And right, they're on the same side currently in the Yemeni Civil War right now too. And so that this is sort of a reoccurring theme. And one of the reasons why everybody was on this side was they saw stopping the Yemen from joining the United Arab Republic. It ended up joining the United Arab States. They saw stopping Yemen from joining and then keeping the monarchy in place as a way to prevent the Arab world from unifying. They saw it as a step and possibly even a way to hurt Egypt. The civil war that Egypt gets into is catastrophic for Egypt. There's no two ways about it. People will frequently refer to it as Egypt's Vietnam. Nobody knew this at the time, but apparently Yemen was Arabic for Vietnam. This is an anachronistic way of looking at the world because Egypt went into Yemen before the United States became heavily involved in Vietnam. So really, Vietnam is the United States is Yemen. But of course, we always look at the world through our own lens and not anybody else's. It's worth pointing out, though, something really amazing happened. So Egypt is in a situation where it doesn't know who the enemy is. They're constantly being attacked. It's chaos. It's what you would expect from a guerrilla war. In the end, though, Egypt wasn't defeated, not in Yemen. Egypt was defeated in Egypt. Israel in 1967 launches the Six-Day War and attacks Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in what has to be the most humiliating rout to take place in the 20th century. Itty-bitty little Israel takes out Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in 6 days. Now, the reason is because the Egyptian military was in Yemen fighting the civil war, and so Egypt was caught completely off guard. They were in no position to fight anybody at that moment. And they had gotten assurances from the Johnson administration that Israel would never attack. That the reason Israel wouldn't attack is the United States had sent negotiators to Egypt, and Israel couldn't attack while the negotiators were in Egypt because that would ruin the United States' ability to broker any kind of deals, and Israel totally attacked while the negotiators were in Egypt. So it was a disaster. The result was that Egypt never recovered. From militarily, politically, in international affairs, there was no recovery whatsoever. But the side that Egypt was fighting for in Yemen won. The socialists succeeded in toppling the monarchist government. And so, unlike Vietnam, where our side lost, in in Yemen, Egypt's side did win, which is a little bit of a twist on the story. I think everybody just assumes Egypt's side ultimately failed. The reason all of this matters is because once Egypt was out of the picture, there was really nobody left in the Arab world to take up that mantle. There was nobody with the material authority to do it. There was nobody with the moral authority to do it. There's just no infrastructure there in place to replace Egypt as the champion of Pan-Arabism. It's also worth pointing out that Egypt, Yugoslavia, and India were in an alliance. And it wasn't just with those three states. The alliance was much greater than that. Nasser, with Nehru and Tito, had created the non-alignment movement. And their goal was not to get caught up in the Cold War, but rather to push back against the Cold War and create a third path. So rather than join Warsaw Pact or NATO, you would join the non-alignment pact. And by the high water mark in the 1960s for the non-alignment pact, there were more members in the non-alignment pact than there were in NATO and the Warsaw Pact combined. In other words, from a global strategic positionality, Nasser, Nehru, and Tito had actually succeeded. And they were funding rebellions against empires. For example, the uprising in what eventually became the Democratic Republic of Congo, but then Zaire, and then now it's back to being the DRC, that was actually funded by the Egyptians. The non-alignment movement was an attempt to sort of liberate the third world and jettison the first and the second world, and to go their own way. So Egypt's defeat in 1967 isn't just a death knell for Pan-Arabism, it was also a pretty devastating blow for the non-alignment movement. And India and Yugoslavia sort of go their own way afterwards. the United States then pulls off a coup. And the coup is by getting Egypt to switch sides. And they pull it off in the aftermath of the 1973 war. And the United States courts President Anwar Sadat, and they bring Egypt over into the United States camp. So I think people tend to see Nasser's Egypt as a Soviet ally. That's not technically accurate. Egypt and the Soviet Union totally worked together. There was definitely cohesion between the two. But Egypt was never a full-fledged ally. In fact, one of the really interesting twists is Egypt was fiercely anti-communist. Egypt was socialist, but anti-communist. And so the Soviet Union and Egypt always kept having these ideological issues where they would clash. And of course, since Egypt's doing the non-alignment thing, the Soviet Union thought, well, at least they're not allied with the United States, right? And so they saw it as the lesser of two evil outcomes. But it was never a full-fledged alliance. What the United States was really doing is grabbing Egypt out of the position as champion for the third world, grabbing Egypt out of the position as champion for pan-Arabism. And it succeeds. The United States pulls this off, but in the process, Egypt is then relegated from a position of being a regional power to being a regional non-actor. Part of the deal was that Egypt had to recognize Israel. Egypt had to normalize relations with Israel, and that, of course, that alienated Egypt from the rest of the Arab world. Having said all of this, there's something really important that I want to bring up that ties into the United States and then brings me back to the place where I started, which was the collapse of a regional superpower. So the last regional superpower was, of course, the Ottoman Empire. And if you try to figure out what date, like I have obviously done this, what year is it when the Ottoman Empire ceases to be that superpower? And the really crazy thing is that moment is also the moment when the United States sort of enters the world stage. That there's a strange connection between the United States and the Ottoman Empire. So the first twist in the story is the first state on earth to recognize the United States independence is Morocco. The Sultanate of Morocco recognized the United States right before Denmark did, right before the Kingdom of Denmark did. And so Denmark and Morocco get that weird status. And for years, in Denmark, I still think they celebrate the 4th of July. But for years, they celebrated in Morocco too. They don't anymore, but we don't need to get into that story. It just has to do with us lying to them and upsetting them. But that's just U.S. foreign policy at that point. The reason why that matters is the Ottoman Empire never conquered Morocco, but the Ottoman Empire converted Morocco into a vassal state. In other words, Morocco kowtowed to the Ottoman Empire and had to at least do the Ottoman Empire's bidding from time to time. So there was this sort of weird Ottoman link to our independence. And if it had stopped there, it'd be boring and I wouldn't have brought it up. What's really interesting is that our first foray into foreign policy, into international relations, outside of dealing with Native Americans, right? Because I think Americans are good at forgetting this, but all our interactions with Native Americans was with foreigners. We had to conquer them and subjugate them and ethnically cleanse them. That was not a done deal in the beginning. That took a lot of work. Our first foray into foreign policy and international relations with non-Native Americans was, in fact, with Morocco, but not just Morocco, also the city of Algiers, the city of Tunis, and the city of Tripoli, Libya, not Lebanon, because those were the Barbary pirate states. Here's the twist. The Barbary pirate states of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers were actually in the Ottoman Empire. So we go to war with the Barbary pirates and defeat them. We won. We pulled it off. I mean, it was a negotiated surrender. It wasn't like we conquered them or anything, but we made them capitulate to our primary demand, which is that we could send our ships through the Mediterranean without having to pay them off. We do that and in effect attack 3 cities in the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire never gets involved. It would be like it's probably about the equivalent today of if Brazil attacked Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Puerto Rico, and the rest of the United States didn't get involved. Like, oh, that looks bad. And the whole event took 4 years, 1801 to 1805. And in the end, we actually leave as friends, right? The Emir of Tripoli gives us a saber, and that saber now is the ceremonial saber used by the United States Marine Corps, because this is the first United States Marine Corps military action. And it was like a dozen Marines and 500 Greek and Arab mercenaries and 3 Swedish frigates, and we won the day. That was our first foray in foreign policy. But it's also a moment when you notice the Ottoman Empire has really gone into decline, because a part of it is at war and the rest of it doesn't seem to care. The very next year, 1806, Egypt is basically broken away. On paper, Egypt remained in the Ottoman Empire, but in reality, it had effectively gone its own way. The reason all that's fascinating to me is the next part. US foreign policy doesn't deal with the Middle East again until basically 1982. In other words, with exceptions, right? Like I just got through telling you Eisenhower invades Lebanon in 58. There's obviously these little itty bitty moments, but not on a large scale. Our emphasis from 1805 until 1981 was Latin America and East Asia. Right, our focus was on places like Mexico and Venezuela, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, Korea, China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. That's where our focus was. So that if you were to draw a line through 1981, so prior to the Reagan administration, almost no American military personnel ever died in the Middle East. But then on the other side of it, since 1981, almost no American military personnel have died anywhere other than the Middle East. In other words, the US has this massive shift under Reagan, where we completely realign to the point where we neglect Latin America and East Asia. It's great for China because it gives China space to come into its own. It's great for Latin America because they can stop having their governments toppled because the price of bananas got too expensive, hence the term Banana Republic. But it's catastrophic for the Middle East. To give you an idea why I'm saying that, today, Arabs are 6% of the world's population. They are 50% of the world's refugees. But that's at a time when we're having the worst refugee crisis in human history. We have never had this many refugees on the world scene at the same time, and fully half of them are Arab. So clearly the Arab world has suffered from the United States' is foreign policy redirection. Another way to look at it is in the last 25 years, 1% of the Arab world's population has been killed. That's a huge number to lose in a 25-year span of time when you're 6% of the global population. So how do we get to that? With Egypt out of the picture and Israel obviously acting now as a US ally, they're not an ally, for the record, which is why I'm saying acting like an ally. We have never signed an alliance treaty with Israel. So whenever the president says Israel is our ally, that's actually technically inaccurate. But it doesn't matter because Israel acts like our ally and we act like their ally. With Egypt out of the picture and Israel as our ally, and then Saudi Arabia was also our ally, we were in this really weird situation because there's a new state that's trying to exert itself in the 1980s, in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war. And that new state, of course, is Iraq. Iraq was thinking in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war that it would become the new Egypt. And we don't give it any time. The Iran-Iraq war ends, and 2 years later, we've obliterated Iraq's ability to be anything. We've blown up all its bridges. We've smashed its baby formula production facilities. We've blown up its schools, its police stations. We just bombed it, and then invaded briefly and then withdrew. So now Iraq is out of the picture too, and you have to remember Iraq was a very powerful state. militarily, but also economically. It was on the verge of becoming one of the world's first third world states to transition out of third world status. The Iran-Iraq War was terrible for it in terms of debt accumulation, but it actually had some really interesting positive effects as well. So Iraq was in serious debt in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War, but its female labor force was activated. And there is a pretty solid set of evidence that if you can double the size of your labor force, you can double the size of your economy. And just the fact that all the men, right, like if you were an MD, you were on the battlefield tending to soldiers. So what that meant was, what were the civilians going to do? And so what had to happen was the women had to become MDs. And if you were a professor, you were an officer on the battlefield fighting the Iranians. So what did that do? That forced women to become professors, and women had to become engineers. So Iraq actually was going through this really interesting renaissance where all of a sudden women were empowered, women were in positions of authority to the point where 17% of Iraq's parliament was made up of women. In the United States, at the same time, 1990, 2% of our Congress was made up of women. Iraq literally had 8.5 times better representation for women than the United States did at the same point, which was just 30 years ago, for the record. Right? We're not talking about 300 years ago. It's just 30 years ago. Iraq's now out of the picture, though, in 91. We've imposed brutal sanctions on Iraq. Under the Clinton administration, 100,000 Iraqis died per year under those sanctions. We literally cut off their food and their medicine. Of the 800,000 Iraqis who died, 500,000 were age 5 and under, right? Because they're obviously going to be a vulnerable portion of the population. So, 90s roll along. Iraq is in terrible instability. Clinton is literally starving them to death. Clinton does something really strange. Clinton decides that with the Soviet Union out of the way, the United States should change the way it does foreign policy. And instead of expanding the State Department and sort of expanding our presence through diplomacy and through soft power, which, by the way, was always the Democratic theme, right? The Democratic Party would lie and say, if you vote for us, we'll do soft power. We'll expand our presence by trade. And I'm not saying Clinton didn't do that. He certainly did that with China. But overall, that was the promise of the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party would say, no, we're going to make America strong and we're going to do military power. And that was the whole conversation. Clinton is the guy, the Democrat, who begins to turn over some of the authority that was in the Department of State over to the Department of Defense. He begins to militarize diplomacy. And it was probably in part because it was just easier, right? What are those guys doing over there? Well, should we do some research? You know what, let's just bomb it. We'll just figure it out on the other side. And you can see that when he bombs the Sudan and Afghanistan in 1998, right? He's sending cruise missiles in blind, and they're hitting random things to the point where one of the cruise missiles doesn't even hit Afghanistan, it hits Pakistan. It's the whole thing's a mess. And that was a shortcut for Clinton that then is going to have long-term serious ramifications for the United States. Because instead of putting the emphasis on a trained diplomatic corps that speaks multiple languages and makes contact with people and negotiates and bargains and looks for the in, my dog just knocked down some furniture, looks for the in on how to get something done. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to rely on the big stick. And then comes George Bush Jr. So George Bush Jr., of course, he's going to do the second war in Iraq, but he's also going to do the war in Afghanistan. He's going to also then add even more power to the Department of Defense and take even more power away from the State Department. And in fact, he's so devastating to the State Department that a bunch of State Department personnel actually leave. And the result is catastrophic for the State Department. Obama comes along, and Obama comes in and talking big, saying wonderful things. He does a speech in Egypt that excites the Egyptian public. It looks like a new era. Everybody's thinking, wow, could US foreign policy be shifting? He has Clinton as his Secretary of State, and the Arab Spring breaks out. And the Arab Spring is an attempt by the publics of the various Arab states to create more democracy, to get rid of some of the tyrannies. And for the record, the Arab Spring is poorly named in part because it's not just confined to the Arab world. It becomes the whole globe. It's everybody, to the point where we get it in the United States. It's the Occupy movement. It's the Indignado movement in Spain. Greece was in the midst of their own movement. Like China, Hong Kong went into this. Brazil, Chile, everybody began to do the Arab Spring. So it's a really terrible name, but it does originate in Tunisia in December of 2010. The Arab Spring then reconfigures the region in part because it topples tyrannies. The Egyptian tyranny goes down, the Tunisian tyranny goes down, the Yemeni tyranny goes down. It's one state after the other is just going down in a ball of flames. And a lot of those tyrannies were US allies. And the reason we like to deal with those tyrannies is because we didn't have to worry about public opinion in those states. We just needed to work with the strongman who bullied the public into doing what he told them they were going to do. And now all of a sudden, there's this power vacuum and the possibility for actual democracy and actual reform and actual change. And Clinton makes a really interesting set of choices. One, she wants to intervene in Libya militarily. And it's not just her. The UAE wants to do that as well. I remember very distinctly the first time something happened. Mystery airplanes fly over Egypt and bomb Libya. And of course, who could it be? I mean, there weren't many possible people who could have done this. Saudi Arabia, maybe. The UAE. There weren't a lot. There wasn't a big list on who the mystery planes could have come from. And it turned out they were from the UAE. So the next thing you know, the UAE and Italy and France and various states are now bombing Libya, including the United States, trying to get Muammar Gaddafi. And this is after he had been reformed, right? I don't know if you all remember this. He was pariah, and then he suddenly saw the light and became reformed, and now we're bombing him. It's how quickly we changed our position on that poor bastard. He was a terrible human being, don't get me wrong. It's just he was probably thinking, I've made it. So the reason this matters is after we blow up Libya or participate in the blowing up of Libya, and it may be, I have doubts, but doubt is good for you, right? But it may be that had we not intervened, Gaddafi's government could have survived. In other words, the rebellion might have failed had we not intervened. And the story on the side of the rebellion is amazing. It includes a bank robbery conducted by a professor from a university in Washington State who jumps on an airplane in the middle of his semester and stops teaching and flies to Libya, and he breaks into a bank. It's an epic story, right? And a US ambassador who basically gets a car and puts it on a ship and takes it from Greece to Libya and sneaks into Libya and is doing rogue diplomacy. It's a fun story, don't get me wrong. But the aftermath is not fun. It's a catastrophe. The Libyan state collapses. And today Libya is ruled by about a dozen different warlords. One of them has really flexed his muscles in recent years and it's possible, but he's been stopped so far, eventually reunify the state. He is not a Democrat. He's not democratically elected. He doesn't want to create a democracy. He's going to establish a new tyranny, but at least there'll be a state apparatus. In the meantime, Syria, of course, implodes. And that civil war is winding down. It's probably got a year left, I'm totally guessing. The rebels own probably less than 5% of Syria at this point. It's just that the forces working against Syria, like the United States, for example, like Israel, have been successful enough that they've forced Syria to slowly retake that remaining territory. And then, of course, there's the Yemeni Civil War. So the Yemeni Civil War happened So going back to that tyrant that I mentioned who gets toppled, I didn't say his name, I don't think, Ali Abdullah Saleh. So he is the president of Yemen in beginning in 1990. The reason he takes over in this really beautiful moment. So Yemen, there's two parts to it. The British owned the south, and then the north was a monarchy. The monarchy is overthrown. A secular socialist republic is put in its place. The British territory breaks away and goes communist. It is the only communist-ruled state that was Muslim, other than the territory inside the Soviet Union, obviously, other than Afghanistan. And of course, in the case of Afghanistan, it went communist because the Soviets invaded, whereas Yemen actually went communist because the Yemenis wanted it, South Yemen. What ends up happening is South Yemen, which was Sunni, and North Yemen, which was Shia, merge in 1990. And there's this moment where everybody thinks, wow, if they can do this, if they can pull this off, if they can create a single state and they can get along, it'll be like a beacon of hope. And Ali Abdullah Saleh is at the helm of this state. But he's a tyrant. He's a tyrant like all the rest of them. And by 2012, the Arab Spring topples him. At one point, a rocket blows up in his face, tears off half of his face. He's actually flown out of Yemen to Saudi Arabia because Yemen didn't have any hospitals to treat that kind of an injury. The Saudis managed to, with super glue, put his face back together. I actually think they did use super glue in the process. So it is meant as a joke, but not really. And they actually stick his face back together. He actually went back to Yemen and resumed his authority, which blew my mind. I was like, wow, that is one tough guy. He gets back to Yemen, but he's toppled. 2 years later, the Houthis do their uprising. The Houthis are the Shia majority from the north. They managed to overrun the northern part of Yemen rapidly. Like the speed that they operate in is stunning. The government escapes to the south. So in effect, reestablishing the old north-south divide in Yemen. And interestingly enough, Ali Abdullah Saleh actually joins the Houthi rebels. So I guess maybe he thought, wow, this is my chance to overthrow the Arab Spring government that replaced me. At that point, the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, Great Britain, get together to support the government that had to flee, that went to the south. So it's this, it looks all of a sudden like the Civil War did in the 1960s in Yemen. It's the same alliance. And except in this case, Egypt isn't on the side of the Houthis, Iran is. The elimination of Egypt as a regional power, and Iraq, and also now Syria, leaves this massive catastrophic power vacuum. And the power vacuum gets filled by the Islamic Republic of Iran and Turkey. And it's obvious that would happen. Like I don't think any analyst looking at this today could go, oh wow, I didn't see that coming. But if American policymakers didn't know this was going to be the result of blowing up Syria and Iraq and spaying and neutering Egypt, then they should be fired because it's so obvious what else could possibly result. So Saudi Arabia has tried to fill the vacuum. Saudi Arabia has presented itself as, we're the new Arab leadership to replace Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. The problem is they don't have the population, they don't have the industry, they don't have the technology, they don't have the intelligentsia, they don't have the middle class. Saudi Arabia is completely ill-equipped to replace anything. It's not that Saudi Arabia has nothing, it has enormous wealth. It just doesn't have the kind of development that the other states did. If for no other reason, it has less than 1/3 the population of Turkey or Iran, whereas Egypt is bigger than both Turkey and Iran. In other words, replacing Egypt with Saudi Arabia or replacing Iraq and Syria with Saudi Arabia from just an economic standpoint makes no sense. And so Saudi Arabia now is stuck as the torchbearer for the Arab world because the more powerful Arab states are in ruins, pushing back against Iran and Turkey, and it's been nothing but a fail. In the case of Iraq, ironically enough, because the Saudis, there's pretty solid evidence that Qatar and UAE were backing ISIL in its infancy, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. And then they changed their mind, right, and joined the coalition against them. The joke was, why didn't the Emirati pilot blow up the ISIL truck? Well, because the Emirates had just finished the payments on the truck. And anyway, so they joined the coalition. Well, the coalition is Iraq and Iran and the United States and France and Great Britain and Saudi Arabia against ISIL, and the UAE against ISIL. In the meantime, in Yemen, that alliance goes the other way. Now it's the Houthis in Iran against Saudi Arabia and the United States. So in Iraq, we're fighting on the same side, and in Yemen, we're fighting against each other. That kind of complexity is really hard to navigate, right? Because who's the enemy at any given moment is up in the air. To make things more interesting, we use ISIL as an excuse to invade Syria. Syria never invited us to invade them, just like Vietnam never invited the United States to invade Vietnam either. So all of a sudden, the United States is on the ground in Syria, uninvited, violating Syria's its legitimacy and its sovereignty, violating international law for that matter. But of course, who's going to say no to us? The result is that now we have this really weird triangle effect, where Turkey is presenting itself as, oh, do you hate all this instability? Haven't the last 2 centuries really stunk? Do you want to bring back the Ottoman Empire? We're ready. On the other hand, Iran is saying, you know what? We don't want to do empire. What we want to do is an Islamic state, some form of true Islam. Of course, it'll be Shia-based, but nonetheless, that's the offer that they're presenting. And then there's Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is unclear what their offer is, other than money. So here's the twist of twists. When the Iran-Iraq War was taking place, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Oman got together, and they created the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. And the idea behind it was, and the United States was part of this. The United States was like, hey, we'll work with you. And the idea was how to protect the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf, also known as the Arabian Gulf, and how to protect the interests of those small little states, those filthy rich, tiny little states. And they created kind of an alliance. They became friendlier than they were before. In the midst of the Arab Spring, Qatar decided it was going to go its own way. For example, Qatar was funding Morsi, the Brotherhood president of Egypt, while Saudi Arabia was funding the opposition. And then, of course, even after everybody had abandoned ISIL, Qatar was still sending money to ISIL. The reason I'm pointing all of this out is, in 2017, the GCC alliance cracks. It fissures. And Saudi Arabia asks all of its allies to boycott, blockade, stop trading with Qatar. They're gonna cut it off from the rest of the world. The poorer states like Egypt can't afford that. But the Saudis were pumping billions and billions of dollars into Egypt's coffers. And so basically Egypt was bought and brought along. And the same is true for Somaliland. Some of you are like, wait, Somaliland, what's that? So Somaliland is a breakaway state in Somalia. It's not internationally recognized, but it's there going, yeah, we're with Saudi Arabia. We're going to cut off Qatar. Like, who cares what Somaliland thinks? But of course, what Saudi Arabia is trying to do is put together the largest coalition it can. It got Senegal to get involved in this. Now, Senegal has since withdrawn. It got Jordan to join with this. It was a huge coalition of states against itty-bitty, teeny-weeny little peninsulas sticking up in the Arabian Gulf. And somehow Qatar has managed to survive this. The blockade is ongoing. And the somehow is Turkey and Iran. Turkey and Iran actually flies food and supplies into Qatar, and they've basically propped it up. In other words, what we now have is a really weird situation where everywhere you look, there are these fires that are constantly flaring up, and the Middle East is destabilizing by the minute. Turkey has signed a treaty with Libya so that now Turkey owns all of the Mediterranean on the eastern half. So if there's any oil anywhere in the Mediterranean, it belongs to Turkey. Well, of course, Turkey doesn't have the authority to do this, and Libya doesn't have the authority to do this. It's truly just a symbolic gesture, but it's a great way to poke everybody in the eyeballs. Poke Egypt in the eyeballs, Israel in the eyeballs, Syria in the eyeballs. It's just a way to say, here we are, we're the Ottoman Empire, and we're back. So in the meantime, another really amazing, strange thing has just happened. And that is that Israel and the UAE have normalized relations. Like earthquake. and you know, like the headline I saw on BBC, I think it was 2 days ago, said Emiratis and Israelis are getting together on social media to chat. Like that's the headline on BBC. Really, that was the most important thing going on planet Earth at this moment. And then, of course, in all of this is Trump. So President Trump has been anything but consistent, and as a result, there is no Middle East foreign policy that the United States has. 1 minute we're bombing Syria, the next minute we're talking to the Russians about how we're friends and we're going to work together. 1 minute he's threatening Turkey, the next minute he's working with Turkey. The next minute he's you know, 1 minute we're working with the Kurds, the next minute he's basically backstabbing the Kurds by letting the Turks invade Syria deeper. But having said that, I think two things sort of encapsulate what Trump has pulled off in terms of foreign policy in the Middle East. One, obviously, is moving the embassy to Jerusalem. We don't really have, I want to wrap this up in 2 minutes to leave time for questions. So I'm not going to get into the details of that, but suffice it to say, that ends all paths for a Palestinian state to have Jerusalem as its capital, which really, for all intents and purposes, ends the two-state solution. So for the record, the two-state solution is already in place. People keep saying, we need to do a two-state solution. We have. We've done basically a Bantustan-style, Botswana two-state solution for Palestine. The question is that second state, that Palestinian state, going to have the ability to function like a state, or is it going to, for all eternity, just function like occupied territory? And with Jerusalem out of the picture, there's no way to negotiate because the Palestinians keep insisting Jerusalem has to be the capital. There has to be some configuration where they have at least a piece of Jerusalem. The other thing that I think is really hallmark of what Trump has done is the execution of Sulamani, the Iranian general in Iraq. So you have to remember that all the way back in the Obama administration, the United States military was working with Sulamani. They knew who he was. In fact, when we reinvaded Iraq under Obama to fight ISIL, we were invited that time. The Iraqi state went, we're in trouble. Iraq had lost about half of its territory, just for the record. 700 ISIL warriors had overrun 60,000 Iraqi soldiers. And suddenly Iraq was missing half of its land. And so we were invited in. The Iranians were already on the ground. Sulamani was already there fighting ISIL. And we actually told the Iraqis, we will go in under the condition that Sulamani works for us, we don't work for him. So we had an operating relationship with this guy. Killing him does nothing. He was replaced, right? That's the tragedy of the human experience. Everybody's replaceable, right? It's just life. And that's what happened. But what it did do is it legitimized the Iranian regime in the eyes of Iranians, because now they have this martyr, they have this hero that can rally, the state can rally the people around. So Trump then gets up in front of the world and says, if Iran retaliates for this, we will hurt Iran again. And Iran did. Iran retaliated within a day. They attacked US military base, and Trump got up and said, nobody was injured, I'm ready to move on. And he moved on. And then we discovered, no, there were in fact plenty of soldiers who were actually pretty seriously injured. And as far as I know, nobody died, but who knows, right? And so at the end of the day, now what happens is it looks like Trump ran away. It looks like he talked big, and then he did something crazy at random, inexplicable. And then when push came to shove, he just turned and walked away from the fight. And Iran looks like the bully that got away with it, and the United States looks like the bully that ran away. And that's probably not good for US foreign policy purposes because it weakens our position even more. So we've lost our ability to negotiate. The states that used to push back against Iran and Turkey are gone, and the United States has no coherent policy that it's operating under. So anyway, I want to switch this over to Q&A. I think I had promised World Affairs Council I wouldn't talk too long, and I've talked over that time.
We do have a couple of questions, so I guess we can get into those. Michael Cunningham asks, first question, a couple of questions, but I'll go with this first one. He wants to know what your definition of Arab is, or Arabs, and if you could kind of go into that, like, classification or kind of go into that a little bit.
Sure. So there's no simple answer, because if you walk up to an Arab and say, are you an Arab? You might get a no as an answer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that was the right answer. So the obvious way to go is to look at language. Arabic is spoken from Mauritania all the way to Iraq. I believe there's 25 or so states, or it might be 24 states, that speak Arabic as the majority language. So I'm not even including states like Turkey and Iran that have small Arab minorities. So the problem with the language, though, is the Arabic that's spoken in Morocco is shockingly different from the Arabic that's spoken in Egypt, which is shockingly different from the Arabic that's spoken in Iraq. And so there is a common language, but that common language isn't that great as a unifier. There is Fusha, which is classical Arabic. But, you know, like if you walk down the streets in Cairo speaking Fusha, people will laugh and they will mock you and they will repeat back what you just said to them because it's funny. And you sound like a news announcer, because in Egypt, the news is done in Fusha. So it just sounds like you're announcing the news. I think that whenever it comes to national identity, the most important marker about whether or not you're part of a nation is if you say, I am part of this nation. And so another way to look at it is the membership in the League of Arab States. And when you do that, though, you run into another weird issue. Somalia and Comoros are members of the League of Arab States, but Somalis and Comorans aren't exactly what I think most people would define as Arab, especially because they don't necessarily speak Arabic as a native language. And so the answer is that it's complicated. When it comes to genetics, Arabs can be blue-eyed blondes, Arabs can be black, Arabs can be everything in between. There is no genetic marker for an Arab. Arabs can be of Roman descent or Greek descent or Phoenician descent or Egyptian descent or from Arabia, which would make them true Arabs. And that doesn't limit what they are ethnically. So it's really difficult to pinpoint what an Arab is, as opposed to French. It's much easier. But then, then you get to Occitan in the South, and are the Occitan really French? And then it gets all sorts. Anyway, there's no easy answer for anything.
Next question, also from Michael Cunningham. Lebanon today has nearly as many refugees living there as they have their own population. He says, with that said, how can small countries with major problems of their own help out with refugees in the long term?
I mean, that's a fantastic question, because states like Jordan also has this issue. Actually, Jordan, I think, is now 3 refugees for every native. Jordan is literally 3/4 refugee. Now, of course, the bulk of that is the Palestinian population, but they have an enormous number of Iraqi and Syrian refugees. Lebanon had a really interesting refugee policy when the Iraqi and Syrian refugees first started going to Lebanon, which was that they refused to set up camps in the beginning. And they insisted that if you were a refugee and you went to Lebanon, you had to live with somebody in their home, which on the one hand, I think is fantastic because, right, you're literally integrating that person into a home instead of sticking them in a tent somewhere, and you're sort of normalizing their life to a degree. But on the other hand, that home is crowded. The people who live there first are probably going to eventually resent you, even if they welcome you in the beginning. Living with strangers for a long time is probably really irritating. And there were too many refugees. It wasn't practical. And camps began to happen anyway, because there was nothing anybody could do about it. They were technically illegal, but what were you going to do? And so Lebanon simply was overwhelmed. Jordan has basically been overwhelmed. At one point, I think that camp, I can't remember its name now, they disassembled it. But the camp that was in the north near the Syrian border was actually, I think, bigger than Amman, which is, it's terrible when your refugee camps are bigger than your capital. One of the great ways that we could avoid this type of refugee crisis would be if we'd stop blowing up countries. I know I sound like I'm being a jerk, but really, what's the point? We spent $3 trillion blowing up Iraq. How is the world a better place? What did we do that made the world? We took out $10 trillion from the world's economy to do what? To kill 2.5 million Iraqis? Like, what did that get us? And we displaced half of the Iraqi population. We crippled the European Union. Brexit happened because of this, right? Like, there's these ripple effects, not just because of that, also because of Poles, because the English, it turns out, hate Poland. So Brexit was, I oversimplified Brexit, but nonetheless, it was one of the ingredients in Brexit. So the tragedy that has always existed when it comes to refugees is that the third world is always stuck with the bill. Turkey, I believe now, is the largest host of refugees on earth. It might not be Turkey, but before it was Turkey, it was Iran. And, it's always been Jordan, and Lebanon has always had its fair share. And so these third world states end up stuck with the refugee problem that we create. And we don't seem to care. To give you an idea how little we care, there is a town in Sweden of 60,000 people. Half of it is refugee. I don't mean immigrant, I mean refugee. To be clear, I'm being accurate with my language here. So it's got 30,000 refugees. That's more Iraqi and Syrian refugees than the United States and Great Britain combined have. There is one town in Sweden of 60,000 people who have more Iraqi and Syrian refugees than the United States and Great Britain combined do, which is telling, because at the end of the day, then, what we've done is we've stuck Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey with this crisis that we created, and then we refuse to do anything about it. But I mean, it's on purpose. Like, again, we knew what would happen when we blew up Iraq, or if we didn't, why didn't we know what was going to happen before we did it? Like, talk about irresponsible. You didn't know this was going to be the outcome? I don't understand. Maybe you shouldn't have big bombs anymore. We need to take away your toys. We need to give them to some responsible person who won't use them. I don't know if that was a good answer, but it's the best I got.
This next question, if you could kind of clarify Syria's and Vladimir Putin's like bilateral relations, and I guess this is the last part of the question, would have Syria been able to defeat the rebels without their help, meaning Vladimir Putin's
right. Let me answer that last part first, because the answer is really simple. No, Syria was on the verge of collapse when Putin finally intervened. The Russians really did come to save the day for the Syrian regime. The reason why the Russians intervened was it's got more than just a strategic reason. There's a historical reason. So if you run the clock back and you go back to the 1956. So Egypt wanted to build the Aswan High Dam. And to do that, they needed a plan, and the Germans provided Egypt with the plan, free of charge. They designed the dam, but now they needed the money to pull it off. So they had a design, now they needed money. And the way they were going to do that was they nationalized the Suez Canal, and they were going to charge taxes on ships going through it. And Great Britain, France, and Israel attacked Egypt to prevent that from happening. So the Egypt then on the other side went, how are we going to get this thing done? And the answer was the Russians. The Russians came along and said, we'll fund it. You build it, we'll fund it. And so that's what happened. And what that did was that made it so that Egypt went, well, the Soviets really aren't the world's biggest jerks. And it opened up the possibility that Nasser would work with the Soviet Union. When Egypt and Syria unified and then broke up in 1961, the Soviet Union was really eager to help Egypt and Syria, and it eventually fostered this relationship that in 1967 and then again in 1973, it was the Russians who came through for Egypt and Syria in their wars against Israel. In the aftermath of the 1973 war, Henry Kissinger went to Syria. And Kissinger's goal was to get Egypt. That was his goal. And Kissinger did something that like, sometimes I feel like I must be in a Twilight Zone episode. He went to the Syrian government first. He went to Hafez al-Assad, who had been the ruler of Syria for about 3 years at that point. And he said, look, I want to fix this. I want to fix it. I want to get it so that we don't just make peace between Israel and Syria and Israel and Egypt. I want to solve the Palestinian problem. I want to figure out a just solution for the Palestinians. And Hafez al-Assad's like, really? You want to do this? And he goes, yes, the United States is done with the destabilized Middle East. We're going to help stabilize the Middle East. I am here to figure this out. We're going to get Egypt on board. We're going to get Jordan on board. We're going to get the Palestinians on board. We're going to make one treaty that covers the whole Middle East, and we're going to do peace in the Middle East. Hafez al-Assad goes, I'm on board. I'll do whatever you ask. Let's do this. Kissinger then flies to Egypt. He goes and he meets with President Sadat, and he says, look, I've been talking to the Syrians. I've been talking to the Palestinians. I've been talking to the Jordanians. None of them are willing to work with Egypt. You're on your own. I am so sorry about this, but the whole rest of the world it's dog eat dog. Nobody works together. Egypt is really on its own. We're here to help you. We'll make you a deal with Israel. It's going to take us a few years. It ends up taking 6, right? But it's going to take us a few years, but we'll make a deal with Egypt. Sadat goes, okay, let's do it. Let's do it. We'll go our own way. Word gets back to Hafez al-Assad that Egypt is going its own way. There's not going to be some sort of pan-Middle East peace treaty. And his mind is blown. He can't believe what Kissinger just did. He can't believe how he was suckered into this. He actually announced that there was going to be a pan-Middle East peace treaty. And now he looks like an idiot. He was destabilized in that moment. And I honestly think what happened was he decided that every word that ever came out of any American's mouth from that point on could not be trusted. And he then went to the Soviets and said, I'm ready for a full-fledged alliance. We've been doing this co-belligerent thing for a couple of decades. Let's go the rest of the way. Let's be allies. And in that moment, Syria became the Soviet Union's only real, true, full-fledged ally in the Middle East, especially once Egypt left the non-alignment pact and went with the United States. And in fact, Latakia, the port city, has the Soviet Union's largest, let me do that again, the Russian Federation's largest port facility outside of Russia. And so when it became clear that Bashar al-Assad's government was going to fail, I think what Putin did was he went, wow, this is the end of the Soviet Union for real. Like the Soviet Union was gone already, obviously. But there was no turning back because this was the last remnants of the Soviet Union's empire outside of the Soviet Union. And I think, honestly, the reason he interfered was not just strategic, but it was also sentimental. That this was a moment for Russia to reflex itself and he could make a PR stunt out of it. And he's been wildly successful. He not only stabilized the Syrian regime, the civil war is almost done.
Next question, also from Michael Cunningham. He wants to know, what do you think about the Turkish government converting 2 famous formerly Orthodox churches? And then also to address the last part of this question, what is Turkey doing here, and what problems will the Kurds present to the Turks in the next few years?
Okay. So thanks, Michael, for all these fantastic questions. So I'm just going to put it out there. I have really strong sentimental feelings for the Hagia Sophia, and I'm intentionally pronouncing it Hagia Sophia instead of Hagia Sophia. In Turkish, there's no G, so that's why it's Hagia Sophia in Turkish. You probably know this about me already, but I'm a student of history, and I get really attached to these landmark structures. So when Turkey did this, I was really disappointed. But not completely, and I'll tell you why. So it was the Hagia Sophia was, of course, built in the 6th century AD as a cathedral, and it's stunning. The architecture is amazing. It does multiple things. It's not just that it's structurally stunning. The nave is in the middle of the cathedral instead of on the side, like in most churches. And then the way the dome is built, the sound waves reverberate off. So when you're in the Hagia Sophia, if you had people there to worship, so you had the place filled, their breathing the sound of the breathing bounces off the walls, and it sounds like a stream. It sounds like a babbling brook. Like the Romans, when they built this thing, didn't just build an amazing piece of architecture. They built something with the intention of creating a specific sound, which to me is a level of art that, that's pretty cool. You're aiming for a sound. When the Ottoman Empire captured it, of course, it was this incredible symbol because it's so beautiful and because it's such a marvelous work of architecture. And they converted it into a mosque. And so it had been a mosque from 1453 until 1919. I don't know if I have my year right. 1920, it got decommissioned as a mosque somewhere around then and was turned into a museum. Now, the reason the Turkish state did that was twofold. One, they were trying to soothe over Eastern Orthodox feelings about the place, right? Because they had lost it as a cathedral, and this is a way to sort of go, it's not even a mosque anymore, it's just a museum. The other reason to do it was to secularize Turkey. So in other words, by converting it back into a mosque, what Erdogan is actually saying to the world is, Turkey is no longer secular, we're an Islamist state again. We might as well be called the Islamic Republic of Turkey, which has been the trajectory he has been taking Turkey on the entire time he's been in power. For me, there was a way better solution that should have been done years ago, which would have been this. Since the Muslim Sabbath is on a Friday and the Christian Sabbath is on a Sunday, why not have the Hagia Sophia be a museum 5 days of the week, and then hand it over to the Eastern Orthodox Church on Sunday and hand it over to an imam on Friday, and have it be both, and turn it into a place to celebrate both traditions, and then embrace both histories. And then that way you're not erasing, because on the one hand, not letting it be a religious structure is really kind of weird, because it's a religious structure. It was meant to have worshipers in there. So I guess I'm mourning the death of the Turkish secular state, but I'm also mourning the death of an opportunity to have mended a bridge. If he'd also made it a church, that would have been an amazing moment. Think about it, right? One structure, and it's both a mosque and a church at the same time. I don't know. It would have been such a good solution. The Kurds is a complicated problem because Kurdistan isn't just in Turkey, it's also in Syria, it's also in Iraq, and it's also in Iran. And basically, Sykes-Picot, when they were carving up the Middle East, they screwed the Kurds on an epic scale. The Islamic Republic of Iran is stable, right? There's no reason to think that Kurdistan in Iran is going to get independence anytime soon. In the case of Iraq, Kurdistan is de facto independent. It has its own flag, it has its own currency, it has its own military, it has its own uniforms. During the ISIL invasion, the Kurds actually pushed back out into Iraq and gobbled up a bunch of territory from ISIL that the Iraqi state had lost, and basically almost doubled the size of Kurdistan. And then declared all the territory they had captured was going to remain in Kurdish control. And then, and I don't know what they were thinking, declared their independence. And when they did that, that forced the Iraqi state then to counterattack, right? Because as long as that territory was still in Iraq, they could ignore the fact that the Kurds had seized it. And the Iraqi state did counterattack and basically recaptured all of the territory that it had lost to ISIL and then lost to the Kurds. So and then forced Kurdistan to recant its declaration of independence. So officially Kurdistan is back in Iraq. And then in the case of Syria, the Kurds were obviously heading towards independence, but Turkey wanted to invade Syria to prevent that. When Trump pulled the troops back from the Turkish border to allow the Turks to invade Syria, the Kurds in Syria went running to the Syrian state because they had just lost their ally, their completely unreliable ally. Like, who makes an alliance with the United States anymore? You have to be insane because you clearly didn't read history. We will dump you, abandon you, backstab you. It's terrible. We need to stop doing that. And they went running to the Syrian state and they said, we surrender. And Syria said, okay, here are our terms. And if you agree to these terms, we will defend you. And the Kurds went, we agree, we surrender. So the Kurds in Syria have agreed to remain as an autonomous region within Syria, within the Syrian state. In return, Syrian and Kurdish forces are cooperatively working to prevent the Turks from invading Syria any deeper. And they're basically blocking Turkish forces, so that if they do attack, they have to attack both Syria and the Kurds at the same time. So Kurdish independence is probably dead because of mistakes in Iraq and then because of Trump in Syria. But the Kurds aren't going to give up in Turkey anytime soon. So I imagine as time unfolds, there'll be more military actions and more violence. The Turkish state fears that it would be losing more than just Kurdistan if it loses Kurdistan. It fears that it would be a loss of credibility globally. Like, we just lost a piece of territory. Maybe the rest of the Turkish state isn't intact. And I think that's why they're holding on so tightly. I think it's the same reason that the British hold on to Northern Ireland. If I were British and I were doing the math, I would totally jettison Northern Ireland. I'd be like, yeah, you're on your own, bye. But I think they can't now because, right, they painted themselves into this corner and they're stuck. And they're stuck holding on to this thing that I don't think they want. But now with Brexit, I'm sure everything's going to be just fine. I'm sure it's not going to be a catastrophe. Anyway, so that's my answer for the Kurds.
Okay, we have a question from John Bretz. He says, so what's going to happen with Qatar and Blockade?
That's a great question. I think as long as Iran and Turkey keep sending stuff to Qatar, there's no reason on earth for anything to change, right? Because Saudi Arabia isn't going to invade. It would be a weird, illegitimate move, right? So that's off the table, and it would give Iran all sorts of excuses to ramp up its hostility towards Saudi Arabia. So I suspect it'll be status quo at least for a while. But having said that, I don't see a solution, because if you're Saudi Arabia, how do you back down now? Because it's not like it's not like Qatar has changed its behavior. It's still the same Qatar. It's still sort of the rogue Gulf state that's gone its own way. Just for the record, when they first started doing this, I thought it was Iroquois Confederacy. So the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy would make treaties with the British and the French as if they were six completely independent entities. And the British and the French didn't know that they were in a confederacy together. And so the way the Iroquois Confederacy was set up is the Six Nations took care of their own domestic policy separate from each other, but they did foreign policy together. So there was literally no way for the Oneida to go make a treaty with British without getting the consent of the other 5 nations. So when one nation, when the Onondaga went and made a treaty with the French, and the Oneida made a treaty with the British, what the British and French didn't realize is they were talking to each other and had worked out this. And so then they pit the British and the French off against each other. I thought that was Qatar's move. I thought they were just pitting off the Brotherhood and Iran and Turkey, and they were playing them. And it turns out, no, apparently this really wasn't Qatar going rogue. Who would have guessed? Anyway.
Okay, if there are no other questions, all great questions, by the way, and well answered, then I will, on the behalf of World Affairs Council, we want to thank you, Dr. Casagranda, for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. And as a reminder to our members, look out in your mailbox for our next event.